No, the title isn't clickbait. Rabbit&Steel is probably the best release I've played all year. How is it better than another roguelike such as Balatro? Well, let me tell you. First, you're going to need to understand what Rabbit&Steel is all about. Rabbit&Steel is a co-op roguelike which you can play with up to 4 people. It's based on the MMO raiding experience except without all of that grinding. You can hop into bosses with your friends without needing the dreaded cooking stat. So far, there's a total of 10 classes, 5 of which are going to be automatically unlocked and 5 of which you'll need to unlock by playing the game. Each class has 4 moves to use in combat: primary, secondary, special, and defensive. Your primary and secondary can be used as often as you want, but they usually do less damage. Meanwhile, your special is going to be your main source of DPS, but it's going to have a pretty high cooldown. Your defensive also has a cooldown, and it varies depending on what class you pick, but all defensives have one thing in common, and that's that they always give you invincibility, which is really helpful. The reason the invincibility is helpful is because this game is a bullet hell type game, and you only have 5 HP. Fortunately, you do have your friends to help you out, and the mechanics play into this really well. The mechanics require you to group up, spread out, or tether you to certain allies, so you have to move accordingly. When you do accidentally kill all your friends, though, unlike in real life, they actually will come back. Give them 5 or 10 seconds, and so long as someone is still alive, they should come back. Of course, when you're alone, these mechanics do change a little bit. Mostly, the pace is faster, there's more bullets, and you aren't going to be reviving. Fortunately, you do still get to experience some of the cool mechanics, they're just lessened a little bit. The game is pretty difficult, but with 4 difficulty modes, being cute, normal, hard, and lunar, pretty much anyone can enjoy the game, even if they're a casual player or a hardcore player. Some things to note about the difficulties is that hard and lunar mode will add timers to enemies. This means if your DPS isn't high enough or you aren't able to kill the enemies in a fast enough time, they will start doing unavoidable damage to you. Fortunately, the timing isn't too tight. As long as you're skilled enough to actually take on that difficulty, it shouldn't be an issue. Additionally, lunar mode on top of all that is going to reduce your HP to 3. When you actually get into a run, you start into what I like to call the tutorial zone. The tutorial zone has 3 enemies, and between each enemy, a chest. But before we talk about chests, let's talk about the enemies. The enemies are more like bosses. These big baddies have big HP bars, big hitboxes, and fill the screen with bullets and other effects you'll need to avoid. If you manage to beat these 3 enemies, then you'll move on to one of 5 areas, which has the following things in order: a shop, 3 more enemies, a chest, and then a boss. And if you manage to beat 3 of these areas, there's also a 6th area, which will hold the final boss. You may be wondering what makes bosses different from normal enemies, and they're mostly just harder, but they also have second forms, which are just really cool. Now, I should probably explain chests. Chests hold relics, which give you permanent upgrades, and they also heal you by 2 just in case you're getting a little bit low on health. But be careful, 2 people cannot choose the same relic. So if you do end up choosing the same relic as someone else, it'll perform an RNG roll, and whoever wins will get the relic, and everyone else will have to pick a different relic. So try to be fair on who gets which relics and strategize with your team. You'll also unlock a lot of additional relics as you play. As I mentioned, before each area aside from the tutorial zone, you'll get a shop. The main functionality of shops is to purchase gemstones. Gemstones completely change your moves with powerful upgrades. There's 4 gemstones for each move, which means 16 total upgrades across only 1 character. The shop also sells potions, which are potent effects that last until the next area, full heals, which are very necessary, and levels, which will boost your damage by 1% for each level, just in case you're left with a bit of extra money. It is worth noting you get gold and levels from combat. Now let's hop into the review by discussing the concept, which will go over how the game feels and how it plays. The game feels quite a bit different from what I'm used to when it comes to roguelikes, since it plays a lot more like an MMO or bullet hell. The closest thing I could really compare it to would probably be Hades, because they both feature bosses with bullet hell mechanics, and the boons can feel kind of similar to relics, and the dataless hammers kind of similar to gemstones. But that's about where the similarities end, because Hades is a solo dungeon crawler, and this game is a multiplayer boss rush. What I love about this game is it manages to be simple and fun for casual players, but also difficult for hardcore players. I really like this because it's made it very easy to get many of my friends into the game. Speaking of friends, the co-op is insanely fun. I love the focus on team strategy because pretty much every enemy's mechanics will in some way force you to interact with your teammates, be it tethering you together so you have to move together, matching colors with certain teammates but not with others, getting in the circle making everyone group up, spread out which makes everyone scatter, and plenty more fun effects. And honestly, single player is still surprisingly fun, because it keeps most of those mechanics and just ties you to the enemy or the board instead of just your allies. There is one thing you can only get from single player though, and that's the story. The story itself is somewhat generic, but it's honestly pretty solid. The dialogue is really funny, and it's well dispersed throughout your runs. The delivery of story beats is handled really awesomely, mostly because of the music and art, but we'll get to those later, but also because of the build-up and NPC dynamics. I loved seeing the little quirks of each character, and I loved seeing how characters felt on other characters and slowly went to express themselves to other characters. It was just really cool. The biggest flaw with the story is that it's a single-player only experience, which made it really easy to miss out on. I didn't even know there was a story until about 10 hours in when I decided to do a solo run just to get a bit better at the game, and all of a sudden I was surprised to see there was a big scroll that gave me the prologue to the story, and it was pretty awesome. I think a good way to fix this would be to either speed up the story to where it's finished within 3 single-player runs, because not many people are going to stick around single-player for too long, or, more preferably, make the story multiplayer compatible, either with some sort of campaign toggle, or only compatible on private lobbies. That way you can still play through the story with your friends, or find some people who are willing to sit through some of the story with you. Now, bringing it back to the art and music, because that's a big reason the story feels so well done, the art style is honestly super cute. From the cute little chibi characters you play as and fight against, which have lovely animations for each move, and the surprisingly detailed scenes in the story that actually convey a lot of emotion, as these scenes usually include whole body shots of characters portrayed with multiple panels, and it's really cool. Not to mention, the backgrounds of the game just look fantastic. The music is on an equally awesome level though. The music is made by Steel Plus, so huge shout out there, and it features a plethora of different tracks. There's a few tracks for each area, one out of combat theme, an in-combat theme, and then the boss theme for that area. All of the themes are beautiful and they fit the areas perfectly. Not a single track in this game misses, but some of them hit especially hard. Emerald Lakeside, the final boss theme, and the Church Mouse boss theme all hit very hard. I'll play the Church Mouse boss theme for you right here so you can give it a listen. I won't spoil Emerald Lakeside because going there is a treat on its own. Just trust me when I say everyone who plays the game raves about how good Emerald Lakeside soundtrack is. I only have one more kind of weird complaint for this section. It's that the controls start out weird and a bit cumbersome. They try to make you use mouse and arrow keys for the movement, and then Z, X, C, and V for skills. But this can be easily rectified by going to the control settings, and me personally, I would suggest using W, A, S, and D for movement, your attacks on mouse, and then your defensive will feel really nice on your spacebar because it'll make it feel fluid and flush with your movement, which will help you weave through certain dangerous attacks. Overall, I'm going to give the concept area of this game 9.5 bunnies out of 10. The actual gameplay is a blast, and the idea is very fresh. The art and music are all I could really ask for, although more stuff like Emerald Lake would shoot this game over the moon. The story is solid and well delivered, but simple. The main things I think this section could work on would be better story integration, because right now no one's really going to see the nice story that's been created, and better starting controls or a handful of presets on the first boot so players don't have to immediately go to the controls and can get right into the game. The next section we will be talking about is game balance. This section covers the more technical side of the game, like specific relics, enemies, and mechanics. Fortunately for this game, all of the mechanics feel absolutely wonderful. I really love how it forces you to engage with your allies. A lot of places stop at healing or buffing your allies and just fighting the same enemy, but it still feels almost like you're isolated. In this game, every movement and every defensive action you take is usually with your allies in mind, which is just really awesome. That being said, I would argue this game is more skill than luck. Once you get consistent at the difficulty you want to play at, you can usually win each run on that difficulty regardless of your luck. Additionally, you can pretty much win as any character you want because I'd say they're all very balanced. In my opinion, a good way to test this in games is to look at what other players are doing. For example, is there a class that no one plays? Is there a class that a lot of people play? Or is there a class that when they join, their DPS is always the highest? In this game, I would say none of those are really true. I see a wide array of every class when playing, and none of them are always out DPSing the others. Now, I will say some classes are just easier to enable. That's because most classes only have their special as their main form of DPS, whereas about 3 classes can rely on their primary as their DPS source, which gives them more diversity and freedom of relic choice. On the topic of moves, why don't we talk about move gemstones? The move gemstones feel great. I've pretty much picked up each one once or twice on every character. Some of them are a bit more niche, but each one fills a purpose for a certain build or certain playstyle. And honestly, depending on the playstyle, I often disagree on good and bad gems with people, which is generally a good sign because it means all gems can be usable depending on your playstyle. Now, I do wish shops had a reroll feature for gems, because getting ones that don't really fit with your build the entire game really sucks. especially since you can see repeats, so you might be seeing the same gym over and over and over again. And I actually see people complain about this more than really anything else in this game. Additionally, when you finally do get to the 6th area, a lot of times you're left with way too much money and half of your kit unupgraded because you just never found the gemstone you really want. Although one thing I really like about gemstones is that they alter your gameplay and build an absolute ton. They pretty much completely overwrite your moves, and they even make some do no damage but buff your special or another move that would fit well into your kit. And additionally, a lot of the effects synergize really well with relics. For example, the Sapphire Gemstone line typically makes your attacks multi-hit, which pairs really well with relics that add flat damage. For example, there's relics in the game that'll add, say, 30 damage. Since your attack hits 3 times, that 30 damage becomes effectively 90 damage. And so the relics and gemstones work really well in tandem. On the topic of relics, I really like the relics in this game because they all feel very impactful and unique. In a lot of games you can pick up hundreds of relics, and it leaves a lot of them not feeling too impactful, and you kind of forget they're even there. In this game, you're never going to feel like that. Although, since relics are pretty impactful, they've got to be balanced, otherwise it's going to be very noticeable. And unfortunately, relics are the least balanced portion of the game. None of them are usually outright bad, but a lot of them are just outclassed by a lot of others. There's 2 main reasons for this. The first one is due to specials being so prominent. Obviously, relics that refresh your special, give damage upgrades to your special, or just add in effects to your special are just going to be very good because of how many classes like their special. Meanwhile, relics that want to boost your primary or even secondary are much worse because most classes can't really utilize those. The second issue is a little bit more glaring. Remember how I said that on higher difficulties, enemies have time limits? Well, this forces you to optimize your DPS, which makes DPS relics way better than defensive relics, to the point where on single player, you oftentimes cannot take defensive relics because you need the DPS, otherwise you'll be taking that unavoidable damage. I will say, the more players you have, the more DPS you're going to be doing, so this matters significantly less if you aren't playing on single player mode. Now, on the topic of enemy mechanics, let's talk about the enemies. They all feel really unique and balanced. Each area has different mechanics that they focus on, and each enemy feels really good because they have different attack patterns that you need to learn to get better at the game. Since each player is going to struggle with different mechanics, different enemies are going to be hard for different players. For example, I'm not so great at the stop moving or keep moving mechanics that you'll find in the Emerald Lake, because I often get cocky and stop moving when I think I've avoided an attack, and then I take some damage because I had a keep moving marker on me. There are 2 enemies in specific who I would like to call out for not being that flush with the game. The first one is the final boss. The final boss feels quite a bit easier than the other enemies in this game on pretty much every difficulty. And I don't think this is just because you have a bunch of relics to steamroll them, it's mostly because the attacks are more simple and easier to avoid. Now, I don't necessarily think this is a super bad thing, because to fight the final boss and to get practice in on them, you're going to need to go through the entire run. And so you can't get much practice on them, so them being a little easier might not be the worst thing in the world. And the next one, most people agree that Red Dark House, more specifically the boss, is really hard compared to a lot of the other bosses. That boss took me more practice than any other boss in the game, and on pretty much every difficulty, going there feels like a real challenge, and sometimes when you're worse at the game, you're just hoping and praying you won't end up in Red Dark House. But honestly, once you get the attack patterns down, it's still not too bad. It's mostly bad for when you're first starting out, or you don't have the patience to memorize the attack patterns, and you just want to beat the game a time or two. Now, I will say pretty much every enemy and boss is really intuitive to different builds and damage types. For example, half of the fights reward AoE damage because they have multiple hitboxes on the screen at a time, and an equal amount of fights reward single target damage. For example, one boss, you actually can't damage them until you get rid of their 8 or so companions. This means AoE builds are going to absolutely burst through this boss, and then after your AoE fighters take care of the little grunts, then the single target fighters get their chance to shine. This means DPS often fluctuates depending on the fight, and everyone can feel really impactful. Also, no enemy is immune to specific debuffs like in some games with resistances or whatever. And fights where backstabbing would be almost impossible or just really difficult, such as a boss's second phase, actually always take backstab damage, so those builds will never be gutted. Overall, the game balance section is going to get a 7.6 rabbits out of 10. The characters and gemstones feel nearly perfectly balanced and yet still very unique, though characters do rely a bit heavily on specials, and I would like to see some more variety there. Relics are really unique and impactful, although some of them are lackluster. The debuffs and gimmicks are always intuitive, so builds will never feel bricked, although the gemstones could use some rerolling or some way to control them, as getting repeat ones over and over again often bottlenecks fun. Save for 1 or 2 bosses, the enemies always have unique and fun attack patterns which almost always feel fair. Higher difficulties can turn the game into a DPS check, which arbitrarily punishes defensive players, which I'm not really a fan of. Even though it sounds like a lot of critique, the balance isn't awfully out of whack, and most of these problems are fairly inoffensive and will hardly show up in every run. The next section, replayability, is one of the most important for a roguelike as it represents how long a game can keep you playing. Fortunately, Rabbit&Steel has a lot going for its replayability. We'll start with the most simple. It's an online experience, so your friends and fellow players help breathe life into the game all on their own. And as I've mentioned, the relics pull their own weight too. They're unique and impactful, and I feel like in a lot of roguelikes, you're left wanting for specific combos, and Rabbit&Steel gives you those combos very often, which makes for very defining and interesting builds. Now, Rabbit&Steel does something very clever with their enemies and maps as well. In a lot of roguelikes, you're going to see every enemy each run. In Rabbit&Steel, you actually only see 2/3 of enemies each run. This is due to there being 5 different maps, out of which you only ever play 3 in a given run. I do think a few more maps would really help round it out, because I would like to see 1/3 of the enemies every run or 1/2 of the enemies, but it's still better than a lot of games which has you seeing the same enemies every single run. Plus, people who love a good challenge are going to really like this game's difficulty system, because the difficulty system keeps things fairly similar to what you've experienced before, but adds in way more complex attacks that you've already seen. And as you claw your way up to the higher difficulties, you'll find yourself unlocking the 5 new characters and about 60 new relics. Now, don't worry, just in case you aren't too much into difficulty, you can actually just unlock the relics and characters just by playing naturally. And it's not even gated behind a huge time wall or anything. I would say you could easily unlock every relic within about 15 to 20 hours, which is a pretty fair pace. On the topic of characters, each one feels super unique, but not so different to where I'm hopeless at a new character. They all have different combos to get the most optimal DPS, although it's not too punishing if you don't follow the specific skill combos. But each one has a defensive that's always going to give you invincibility, so as it should be, your safe word is almost always very easily accessible. Now, I do have one kind of big complaint. The first area is always the tutorial area, and even though it has you facing different enemies each run, they're all really easy compared to the other areas. This means that your first 3 fights are going to be a bit less engaging. Fortunately, the fights do go down quick, and they are separated by relics, so that does add to the engagement, although I really don't see what purpose the tutorial enemies serve after the first few runs. Personally, I think it would be cool if there was an option that sped this section up, like only having 1 bigger fight rather than having 3 fights, or just having harder bosses after you've done the tutorial a few times. The replayability section is going to get a striking 9.3 hairs out of 10 from me. The game employs numerous unlocks in an intuitive fashion without gatekeeping them behind difficulty or anything like that. Additionally, the difficulties are very rewarding because they change fights in a fun way. The online features add variance to each run, as social games almost always do, and a plethora of engaging characters and relics means each run is going to feel different for a very long time. The game also has a clever way of only feeding you 2/3 of the maps each run, so it's not going to always be the same. My only complaint is the starting area, which feels a lot less engaging due to the ease of each fight. The next category is the online one. As this game is best played co-op, the status of its servers, matchmaking, and community are really important. My interactions with the community have actually been overwhelmingly positive. The game features a built-in chat system that you can use anytime you aren't in combat. It does kinda suck that you can't talk to your dead allies, so you can encourage them to do just a little bit better. But it makes sense because I'd probably end up chatting instead of reviving myself. In my roughly 30 hours of online play, I've only had 1 or 2 bad interactions, and even then they were really minor. Just people complaining that our teammates sucked, and to be honest, our teammates did really suck, but in our teammates' defense, they were really polite, and they even had the room title slated as Practicing Hard Mode, so I really don't hold that against them, because they were just so friendly and nice and a pleasure to play with. I've actually noticed that people are surprisingly friendly. Whenever I go to select relics, it's very often where I see people just wait for everyone to select the relic they want. It seems like a lot of the veteran players are waiting for the newer players to select the things they want, because the veteran players are confident without even the most powerful relics, they can still hold their own and they want to make sure everyone has fun. And I really appreciate that. Unfortunately, I will say there's not too many rooms open at a time. As of recording, I could always get a 4-person match going in about 5 minutes for the difficulty I wanted. So if you're relying solely on randoms, it might take a minute, so be warned. Unlike when I'm playing any Nintendo product, I've never had any issues with servers or lag or anything. Some people disconnect, but it's not awfully common, and any disconnects I've personally had have always been my fault via internet or whatever. The room making is very intuitive because it prominently displays the difficulty, the first map you'll be going to, and the classes that everyone is playing. The lobby's waiting room is actually really pleasant because it gives you time to chat with your allies and test out your group DPS on a conveniently placed dummy. Now, when disconnects do happen, be prepared to use your defensive because it really makes the game rough. It treats the person like they've died, which means attacks center on them, which can lead to some unavoidable circumstances if you aren't good with your defensive. It would honestly be better if the person was removed instantly rather than at the end of the round. The online of this game deserves 9.0 lunar rabbits out of 10. The servers have no flaws as far as I can tell, and the only issue is when people disconnect, it can get pretty annoying. But this hasn't happened a ton for me, only about 2 times in my entire time playing, and even in those times, it never killed my run. I just had to really play carefully. The servers aren't as populous as I'd like, and that'll likely only become worse with age, but my crippling social anxiety on Discord prevented me from checking if that would have improved my success. So if you're watching this video in a couple months, try to make sure you have some friends to play with. Before we hop into the final review and throw the price into the mix, I would like to spend a bit of time to look at what we know about the game's future, because this game does have some exciting future content planned for it. Starting with what we've already seen, the game has had bug fixes and balance changes rapidly upon release, but has slowed down to about 2 times per month as the developer takes some well-deserved time off. Currently, the developer is mostly focusing on modding support, having already added tools which will assist mod makers and mod players in testing out their mods. But the developer has also expressed great interest in a big DLC with new stages, music, bosses, items, classes, and, well, everything. There's no slated release for this. In fact, the developer has stated it'll probably be a good while, but it seems this game is still far from off the radar. The information we have about the DLC so far is that it's currently planned to be free, although nothing is set in stone yet, and honestly I'll happily throw another $10 at the game if they give me some new characters and some new areas. Additionally, considering the dev has fixed numerous issues and seems to keep in touch with the community and implement their balance changes and suggestions, I think it's fair to say some of the minor issues highlighted here will be addressed in the future. All in all, this game has been an absolute blast to play. It's definitely been my best release of this year, and despite this year being more than halfway over, it's pretty much sold my heart on Game of the Year. I had a blast playing it with friends, climbing the difficulty solo, and hanging out in some random lobbies. My critiques on this game are honestly more minor than your average content creator's dating pool, and I've clocked over 70 hours in this game and I'm still far from done with it. With fantastic gameplay, phenomenal art, and phantasmal music, it's a must recommend to almost anyone I know. And at only $15, it's wonderfully priced. Even my friends who don't really like roguelikes have gotten around 15 hours in it and they really enjoyed their time playing it. And those who do like roguelikes can easily sink 15 hours in this game, if not more. Everyone who I've played it with has had a blast, and honestly it's better than most $60 games I've played recently. You could probably have convinced me to shell $30 on it, although I think the most fair price is within the $25 range. That is to say, at $15, this is an absolute steal. If you like roguelikes and haven't tried this game, or if you just want a good party game to play with your friends, you should definitely give this game a shot. Anyways, that's going to be my review of Rabbit&Steel. If you decided to give this game a go, or have already tried it, leave a comment for me in the community. Were my takes hot garbage, or did I help you see the game in a different light? As always, huge thanks to Minnow Dev for making this wonderful game, Steel Plus for the lovely compositions, and Kitsui Akira for the awesome time in Emerald Lake. Apologies for absolutely butchering those names. Thanks for watching and have an awesome day.